We're joined by former White House Press Secretary Dana Perino, also host of The Five on Fox News, where somehow each and every day she endures an hour with Greg Gutfeld and Bob Beckel. How do you do that, Dana Perino?
Well, an hour with Greg Gutfeld is a lot easier than an hour with Bob Beckel.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, that's easy. But you know what? Here's the thing about The Five. When we came up to do The Five, Bob and I had met, but hardly knew each other. Most of the other of us had not met, and Greg Gutfeld and I had never met.
Huh.
And we all thought that the show was just supposed to be an 8-week thing, temporary during the summer. And now we're almost into our second year.
Well, congratulations.
We're almost finishing our second year.
It's a huge success. Now, you are, of course, former White House Press Secretary. They're opening up the Bush Library, big event. So tell us your thoughts as you look back on your time in the critical role of White House Press Secretary. With the time and passage, do you have a different perspective on it?
I don't think my perspective has changed so much because having been there and having seen the decision-making process in addition to knowing the decisions, I always felt that history in the long run would have to decide whether or not what the legacy was going to be. The library itself, the building, is absolutely gorgeous. Mrs. Bush has her signature all over it because she has such style and grace. Wonderful gift to the city. But I think to me that this moment, it's sort of like an ability to end a chapter. A wonderful chapter in my life was being the press secretary, and that never really leaves you, especially during the first 2 years afterwards. I would wake up every morning, read the papers, and I'd want to call the reporters and try to set the record straight, make sure they got the facts right. And I've learned to let that go a little bit, but time does also help reporters look back with a different lens as well.
Well, okay, so you were the person who had to deal with the president about media issues, and we always heard the president really didn't let the stuff that was in the press, didn't pay a lot of attention to it, let it roll off his back like water off a duck's back. Is that really true, or did it get to him from time to time?
It's remarkable because it is true. I think possibly because he had seen his dad go through 8 years as vice president and then that one term as president. He had been governor for 2 terms. By the time I became press secretary, President Bush just expected negative press. So, Brian, you'll remember, as a press secretary, your job is, I think it's 50-50. It's 50% defending the president and advocating for the president and trying to help him achieve his goals and representing the country. The other 50% is protecting the access for the free press. Because without a free media holding government to account, democracy can't work.
You had to be a conduit and work both sides of that street.
Yeah, and he was more than willing. If I said, look, this is traditionally when the reporters come in, after a foreign leader meeting, or he never went into the press briefing room to give a statement and walk away, because that was the place where the press got to ask questions. And we just held true to those traditions. I think some of those have gone away, and I think that's unfortunate, but it could be reversed.
Well, Dana Perino, that's really what I want to ask you about. I mean, it's impossible not to compare the Bush presidency with what we're witnessing right now with the Obama presidency. And it's so funny to see the president go into foreign lands and sort of complain about the press. You saw him yucking it up with Bibi Netanyahu there, complaining about Chuck Todd asking follow-up questions. But, I mean, please, you're in a unique perspective here. How does the press treat this president compared to how the press treated your former boss, President Bush?
You could play a game every day with the headlines and say that President Bush was in charge, and what the headlines would be if.
Take Benghazi for an example. I mean, would President Bush have gotten away with Benghazi the way that it seems the Obama administration has?
First of all, absolutely not. Secondly, I never ever would have allowed the pushing of the video as the excuse for getting something completely wrong, and that was orchestrated out of the White House. I would have been embarrassed. I would have at least owned up to it. I can understand in the fog of war, you don't really know what's going on, and so you put something out there. But then to keep defending it, I thought that was beyond the pale. And look, the reporters have a lot to blame on themselves because they don't push.
But they certainly pushed when you were standing behind that podium.
Of course, and I expected it, but I was prepared for it as well. Forbes this week said that it listed as the worst jobs in the country, and they put a reporter as the number one thing.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And plus, that's just ridiculous.
Let me ask
being
you.
A reporter is a great job.
Let me ask you this question, because as you are there for the dedication and the opening of this library, I know that there's somebody that you wish could be by your side, and he won't be there. Tony Snow. Any thoughts?
So Tony Snow is the press secretary, and I was the deputy. I was very happy being the deputy press secretary. He was as wonderful a man as you knew him to be, Brian, and as your listeners have ever heard about him. Unfortunately, he died from colon cancer in July of 2008. We will miss him greatly. He was the best press secretary at the podium ever. And I remember something very fondly about him. On his last day there at the White House, he came to see me in my office just next door, and he said, "So how are you doing?" And I said, "Well, not very good." He said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, I don't know how I'm supposed to replace you." And he said, "Come here for a second." So I went over, and he put his hands on my shoulders, and he made me look him in the eye, and he said, "You are better at this than you think you are." And about 2 weeks later, after I'd been doing the briefings, I had a moment where I was just myself for a briefing. And later that night, I realized, oh, I don't have to try to be him. I can be myself, and that's what Tony taught me. What a wonderful piece of advice and a gift, because I've been able to carry that ever since that moment.
Well, listen, it's got to be a moment of reflection for you. And do you have any thoughts about the fact that the people now seem to look at former President Bush more fondly now, according to the polls, than they did when he left office? Why is that, do you imagine?
I think it's time that you never know. You don't get do-overs as president. One of the things at the library that is so cool is an interactive decision theater, where you as a guest at the library can play a game against your fellow tourists, and you get to choose from 4 different scenarios: Katrina, the financial crisis, the surge, and the day of 9/11. And you listen to different advisors that you choose. The breaking news comes across, and the clock is ticking, and you have to make a decision. And I think that over time people realize they might not have agreed with the decision, but they recognize that he always stuck up for America and did what he thought was best. And over time, I think that's proving true, but we'll never know. President Bush has a great line. In the last year of the presidency, he read 3 books about George Washington. And if historians are still analyzing the first president, then the 43rd doesn't have a lot to worry about, because he'll never know.
Dana Perino, I wonder if in the Obama library they're going to have that same interactive thing, but every response will be blame President Bush.
That will be an option.
You're right, exactly. All right. Dana Perino, former White House press secretary and, of course, host of The Five on Fox News. Thanks so much for joining us on this day where we are honoring the opening of President Bush's library in Texas.